All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. La danse de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
L'audience est ouverte.
Court is called to order.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good afternoon to everybody. Madam Court Officer, please call the case.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honors. This is the situation in the Republic of Mali in the case of the prosecutor versus Alhassan, Abdoul, Aziz, Mohamed, Mahmoud. Case reference ICC 0112 0118. And for the record, we're in open session.
Je vous remercie.
Judge Mindua, thank you, Madam Court Officer.
Je demande aux parties et aux
I would now
participants de se
like to ask the parties and participants to introduce themselves, not forgetting
présenter aux
the members of their teams who are taking part from remote locations. Mr. Prosecutor. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Your Honors. Today, the Office of the Prosecutor is represented by myself, Mandia Nyang, Deputy Prosecutor. To my right, Gilles Duterte, Senior Trial Lawyer, Madame Yayoi Yamaguchi, Trial Lawyer, Mr. Musa Alafi, Associate Trial Lawyer. Behind me, we have trial lawyers, Diane Looping and Mr. Lucio Garcia. Then there is Sandra Shooters and Madame Marie-Jeanne Sadachti. And in the third row, we have Madame Paola Saki and Mr. Karim Kunti, Assistant Data Processor. I would also like to point out, Mr. President, I would like to greet you that you are here with us fully fit, and I congratulate you for that. And I also point out that the registrar has decided to grace this occasion with his presence, and we welcome that. I would also like to say good afternoon to all those who are present today, the representatives of the defense and victims, and every other person here and in the public gallery. Thank you. Judge Mindua, thank you, Mr. Prosecutor, for your personal presence and for your team. And now I turn towards the defense. Madam Taylor.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom. The defense for Mr. Alhassan is represented today by, to my left, we have Felicity Gary Casey. We have Alka Pradhan, who is participating by video link. We have Melissa Boyulucia, Havneet Sethi, Hu Ching Liu, Deleta Marchesi. We have Kelsey Ryan, Leila Abid, Maulud Al-Ansari, Quinn Fa, and Claudia Barrero. And my name is Melinda Taylor, and Mr. Alhassan is present today. Thank you very much.
Presiding Judge Mindua, thank you very much, Madam Taylor. And now the representatives of victims council.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Juge Président.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honors. The victims are represented in this hearing by Maître Seydou Doumbia from Bamako, Maître Mayombo Kasongo, who is here to my right, Madame Biyeke Dipanga Prisk, and Mr. Andres Morales, who is behind me. That is the composition of the team. I would like to pay tribute to those who are absent. For example, Julie Goffin and Madame Kapinga, who normally would have been in Bamako also. Thank you. I also would like to salute my learned friends of the defense, as well as the entire office of the prosecutor and the registrar who has graced this occasion. I also greet the members of the public who have taken the time to come and listen to the judgment of today. Thank you. Judge Mindua, thank you very much, Counsel. I thank you and I greet your colleagues who are in remote locations, particularly Mr. Doumbia. The chamber is happy to have the registrar with us today. You have the floor, Mr. Registrar.
Your Honors, Mr. President, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Osvaldo Zavala, Registrar of the ICC.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Registrar. I note that Mr. Alhassan is obviously present, as Metro Taylor has already mentioned. Good afternoon, Mr. Alhassan. After about 1 year, we meet once again in this courtroom, and it is with pleasure that I wish everyone welcome. Pursuant to Article 74 of the statute, the Chamber carried out its deliberations and will file its decision relative to the criminal responsibility of Mr. Alhassan with regard to the charges against him made by the prosecutor. This judgment, which is based solely on the Chamber's assessment of the evidence adduced and examined in the course of the trial, considers whether the prosecutor has proved the guilt of the accused beyond all reasonable doubt or not. Whereas only the written decision is authoritative, I will now proceed to read out a summary of that decision. Let me begin by emphasizing that this case deals with crimes against humanity and war crimes perpetrated in the city of Timbuktu, located in northern Mali, between the 2nd of April 2012 and the 29th of January 2013, as well as the possible responsibility of the accused, Mr. Alhassan, for those crimes. During the aforementioned period,
du territoire malien
several organized armed groups were active in that particular region of Mali.
tout d'abord
First of all,
au Maghreb islamique,
there was Al-Qaida in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM.
encourageait
This group was a promoter of jihad and believed that this objective could not be achieved without fighting against the people that they characterized as infidels.
les combattants d'AQMI
AQIM fighters
étaient
were
originaires
originally
d'Algérie,
from Algeria, Mauritania, and Nigeria, amongst other countries, and they were therefore considered as foreigners by the population of northern Mali.
ensuite
And then
nous avons El
there was Ansar Dine.
locution arabe qui signifie
It is a name derived from an Arabic phrase which translates into defenders of the faith.
essentiellement composé.
This group was mainly composed of Malian Tuaregs.
Le groupe Ansar Dine
The Ansar Dine group called for the independence of northern Mali
et voulait
and intended
un État
to establish an Islamic state covering that entire territory,
son interprétation
where its interpretation of Sharia law
appliquée
would be applicable in lieu of the Malian constitution
et les lois du pays.
and the laws of the country.
En pratique,
In practice, however, Ansar Dine
des objectifs
was merely furthering the objectives of AQIM, Al-Qaida in the Islamic Maghreb.
Ansar Dine,
Besides Ansar Dine and AQIM,
il y avait un autre groupe
there was another armed group known as the National Movement for the Liberation of Awazad, in abbreviation MNLA. The MNLA was a secular and nationalist Tuareg movement.
tous ces groupes
All of these groups were active in the north of Mali
2012
well before 2012, while the region had been the theater of violence for decades.
en dépit de leurs différences,
Despite their differences, the MNLA, AQIM,
Ansar Dine
and Ansar Dine
se sont concertés
negotiated amongst themselves to finally
pour prendre
agree to form an alliance that would seize control of northern Mali in April 2012.
le 2 avril 2012
On the 2nd of April 2012, Ansar Dine and AQIM
sont entrés dans la ville
entered the city of Timbuktu
après en avoir évincé le MNLA
and
et ils en ont pris
took over control of the city after forcing out the MNLA.
Timbuktu était sous leur contrôle
During the time of their exclusive control of Timbuktu,
et à la population
they imposed
une
a series of rules and prohibitions on the population.
La question qui se pose dans cette procédure
The matter to be determined in these proceedings
porte sur le rôle
concerns the role played by Alhassan during the events under consideration.
bien que Hassan
Although Alhassan
pour un
had worked for a group
qui revendiquait
which claimed to be enforcing Islamic Sharia law,
ce procès
this trial
n'a concerné
had nothing
ni la charia
to do with either Sharia law
la religion musulmane.
or the Muslim religion in general.
Ce procès
The trial centered on the actions and conduct of one man, Alhassan,
qui a agi
who was acting within a very specific context.
il a agi
He operated as a member of an organized armed group
des crimes
which committed crimes
dans le champ
that fall within the jurisdiction of the court
et qu'il a justifié
and which he justified
l'application de la charia
as actions meant to ensure the enforcement of Sharia law
territoriale.
while simultaneously pursuing territorial ambitions.
De ce fait, bien loin d'être
In fact, far from reflecting centuries of Islamic law and scholarship
prétendait,
as claimed by these groups,
les règles
the rules that were imposed and the punishments inflicted on the inhabitants of Timbuktu were examples of the practice
Hassan
developed by Ansar Dine and AQIM in Timbuktu in 2012 and 2013,
d'après la compréhension et
which was based on their unique understanding and interpretation of the sources of Sharia law.
comme l'a expliqué
As one witness, P0065, explained in transcripts T046,
046, je cite,
and I quote,
ils ont cité des arguments
"They came with arguments from the Quran,
qu'un imam
and no imam
quelque chose
could say no to something justified with the Quran.
mais tout le monde a sa propre
But everyone has their own interpretation of a Quranic verse.
et là,
And there,
on était en train d'appliquer
they were applying a decision to something that did not come from a religious debate or dialogue." End of quote.
afin, je cite de nouveau,
Once again,
ou
I
d'éclairer
quote, their objective was to instruct or enlighten the so-called ignorant people
considéré comme
of Timbuktu
la foi
on what they consider to be, in quotes, the genuine faith.
AQIM ont
In this way, Ansar Dine and AQIM regulated or prohibited a certain number of practices.
les règles
The rules and prohibitions
édictées par
enacted by Ansar Dine and AQIM
couvraient de nombreux aspects
covered many aspects of the lives of the local population,
et concernaient notamment
and in particular,
dont les habitants
the manner in which the inhabitants of Timbuktu could practice their religion and communicate with God. The possibility and manner of celebrating religious, traditional, social, and cultural events,
ce qu'ils pouvaient consommer,
what they could consume,
comment ils pouvaient
and the way in which they should dress,
et comment
as well as how and with whom they could initiate and nurture relationships.
les femmes en particulier
Women, in particular, were subjected to various restrictions relative to their appearance and their freedom of movement in public places. In particular, they were compelled to cover their bodies and heads with a veil. Otherwise, they risked being punished. Such was their fear of Ansar Dine and AQIM that women drastically curtailed their outings and their participation in social activities, with some of them simply deciding to no longer leave their homes at all. The women explained that they were not going out much in order to avoid, in quotes, problems, as they feared being arrested and punished, adding that no matter what they did, and no matter how they covered themselves, they were always found not to have covered their bodies fully. And this had repercussions on their ability to earn a living. To ensure the proper enforcement of all those rules, Ansar Dine and AQIM set up a rigorous repression structure targeting those who did not comply with the rules and who were considered as, in quotes, recalcitrants. They created dedicated and bespoke institutions to that end, in particular the Hezbollah, the Islamic Police, and the Islamic Court. Each of these institutions was administered by emirs who all reported to the emir of Timbuktu, Abu Zaid. The Islamic police, made up of 20 to 40 members, was the most visible of these institutions. The emirs had given general instructions to the Islamic police and other relevant institutions to force the population to comply with their interpretation of Sharia law while avoiding to the extent possible any clashes with that population. In the course of this trial, the chamber heard from a large number of witnesses and victims who gave accounts of the events that took place between April 2012 and January 2013. They described the punishments inflicted on the population and the suffering that they endured when Timbuktu was under the control of Ansar Dine and AQIM. Such control had serious repercussions on the local population, both psychologically and economically. In particular,
les habitants n'ont
the inhabitants had no other choice but to adapt their lives
pas leur mode de vie
and lifestyles
pour qu'ils se conforment
to conform to the interpretation of Islamic Sharia law
Ansar
that Ansar Dine and AQIM
leur
had imposed on them by the force of arms.
les témoins
Witness P0608
Inscription
in transcript T154
a déclaré ce qui suit.
testified as follows, and I quote,
La population se sentait vraiment
"The people felt really occupied.
on était
How should I put this?
dans une
Everyone,
résistance,
we were in a position of resistance,
une résistance pacifique.
but passive resistance.
C'est comme si tout le monde s'était dit
It was as if everyone had said to one another,
ils ne sont pas venus.
those people have not come to do us any good.
Ils disent qu'ils
They say
amènent la charia
that they have come to bring Sharia law
pour nous rendre
or to turn us into Muslims. But you know,
musulmans.
we were already Muslims and had been for a long time. Even Timbuktu is a Muslim city.
On s'était entendu,
And so
personne ne voulait
there was agreement,
avoir rien à faire avec eux.
and nobody wanted anything to do with them. End of quote.
Entre mai 2012,
Between May 2012 and January 2013,
Alhassan
Alhassan
travaillait pour la
worked
police islamique.
for the Islamic police of Ansar Dine AQIM.
Il avait été recruté
He had been recruited by senior officials of AQIM.
Alhassan a travaillé
Alhassan
avec la police islamique
had been working with the Islamic police
au mois de mai
since the beginning of May 2012.
au cours de la période
During the period covered by the charges,
Alhassan
Alhassan
a rapidement pris du galon
quickly rose through the ranks and his role became increasingly important.
membre actif de la police
He was an active member of the police.
comme
After having started out as an interpreter,
commencé à
he very quickly started drafting reports
exercer des fonctions administratives
and performing
et organiser
administrative duties as well as organizing the work of the police. Alhassan
de la police
remained a member of the Islamic police until
Ansar Dine
Ansar Dine and AQIM left Timbuktu.
même s'il était sous les ordres
Even though he was under the orders of the emirs of the police, Alhassan
un rôle
had
directeur
a leading role
dans
in police operations.
lorsqu'Ansar Dine
When Ansar Dine and AQIM
contrôlait Tombouctou,
were in control of Timbuktu,
la position
the position occupied by Alhassan
était perçue
was perceived differently
les personnes
by different people
puisqu'on l'a qualifié
because he was variously referred to
de commissaire
as commissioner,
quant au commissaire
de facto commissioner,
commissaire adjoint
deputy commissioner,
et ou
and or
second de la police
the second in command of the Islamic police.
En tout état de cause,
In any case,
à partir du moment
from the moment that he started working under Adama,
où le premier émir,
the first emir of the police,
et tant qu'il a participé
and for as long as he participated in the work of the Islamic police,
Al-Hassan,
Alhassan was considered by the local population and by the other members of the police as a key player
des forces,
in the police force.
Al-Hassan pouvait donner des ordres.
Alhassan had the power to issue orders, and when he did so, the police officers followed his instructions.
Il a souvent interagi
He often interacted with the local population on behalf of the police,
en faisant la liaison
ensuring liaison with the people,
avec les victimes,
speaking with victims,
jouant un rôle de
and by acting as mediator in case of disputes,
délivrant des autorisations.
and by issuing authorizations.
Al-Hassan approuvait
Alhassan
des activités des médias
approved media activities on behalf of the police,
en autorisant
for example, by authorizing reports to be made.
également délivré des
He
autorisations
also
à des résidents
issued
et à des journalistes.
authorizations to residents and to journalists.
Al-Hassan
Alhassan
des documents
received documents
menés
and carried out investigative activities
islamiques.
at the premises of the Islamic police.
Il a délivré à des habitants
He issued summonses to members of the local population to report to the police.
il a également participé
He was also
à
involved
l'arrestation
in the arrest of people
de crimes
accused of crimes
par les groupes
by the armed groups,
y compris
including
l'arrestation
the arrest
des Déou
of Dedeu Maiga,
dont la main
whose hand
sera ensuite
was
amputée.
subsequently amputated.
Al-Hassan a participé
Alhassan
à des
took
enquêtes
part
et à
in
des interrogatoires
investigations and interrogations
interrogeant
and
les
questioned
personnes
individuals
et témoins
and other
dans les
witnesses
locaux de la police.
at the police premises.
Il a admis
He admitted
qu'au cours des
that
interrogatoires
during
menés
interrogations
dans des affaires
in
intéressant
cases
les biens publics,
involving public property,
si une personne,
if a person did not tell the truth
après que les preuves
after evidence
aient
had been presented to him or her,
il était nécessaire
it would then be necessary to resort to threats.
si la personne n'avouait toujours pas,
If the person still did not confess after having been threatened,
alors la torture
then torture
peut être utilisée.
could be used.
Si après avoir
And
été
if,
torturé,
after being tortured,
la personne
the person still did not confess,
alors elle était libérée.
then that person would be released.
Al-Hassan a notamment utilisé
In particular, Al-Hassan made use of threats during one interrogation session.
interroger des personnes
He equally questioned people in his office.
la plupart du temps,
Most of the time,
l'émir de la
the
police
emir of the police
était présent
was present
à ses côtés
by his side
pendant les
during
interrogatoires,
such interrogations,
mais il lui est
but he sometimes
procédé
carried them out on his own.
Alhassan était autorisé
Alhassan had the authority to sign police reports,
et il en a rédigé
and he wrote and signed
nombreux.
many of them.
Dans bien des affaires,
In a good number of
les
cases,
rapports de police
the police reports
ont été
were
envoyés
forwarded
au tribunal.
to the Islamic court.
Ces rapports
These
rédigés et
reports,
signés par Alhassan
drafted and signed by Alhassan,
portaient
dealt
diverses questions
with
de droit pénal,
various criminal
de droit
and civil law matters.
Alhassan a conduit
Al-Hassan
condamnés
led convicted persons to the places where the punishments were to be administered.
Il a également été
He was also present
plusieurs fois
on several occasions
lorsque
when public punishments
ont été
were enforced,
en particulier
especially
pour des personnes
in the
condamnées
cases of people
par le tribunal.
convicted by the Islamic court.
Alhassan portait une arme
Al-Hassan
certaines
carried a
de
weapon
ses fonctions
during the performance of some of his duties,
lorsqu'il
in particular when he took part
à l'exécution.
in the enforcement of punishments.
En outre,
Moreover,
Alhassan
Al-Hassan
était parmi les
was among the police chiefs present
des châtiments
during punishments inflicted
au poste de
on the spot at the police station without any judgment having been delivered by the Islamic court.
Alhassan,
Al-Hassan
personne chargée de la
was one of the people in charge of communication
Dine
on behalf of Ansar Dine and AQIM.
il prenait la parole
He would take the floor
promouvoir
to promote the mission
et les objectifs
and objectives
d'Ansar
of Ansar Dine and AQIM,
et exprimait clairement
and clearly expressed his support
et sa participation
and enthusiastic participation
à leurs activités
in their activities in Timbuktu city.
S'agissant de la majeure partie
For the majority of the crimes considered,
Alhassan
Al-Hassan was prosecuted
de l'article 25
under Article 25, 3D of the Rome Statute
contribué
for having contributed to the crimes perpetrated by other members of Ansar Dine and AQIM.
pour quelques événements.
For some
Il
events,
était poursuivi
he was prosecuted
de l'article
under Article 25, 3A
de Rome
of the Rome Statute
pour avoir lui-même
for having
directement
directly committed the crimes himself,
ou sur le fondement
or
de
on the
l'article
basis of Article 25, 3C of the Rome Statute
son aide
for having
son concours
aided and abetted the commission of crimes committed by others.
Je vais à présent procéder à la lecture des principales
I shall now proceed to read the main conclusions drawn by the Chamber,
majorité.
essentially by majority decision. For my part, I will attach a dissenting opinion which relates inter alia to the existence of grounds for the exoneration of Al-Hassan from criminal responsibility.
Alhassan est déclaré coupable
Al-Hassan
à la majorité
has been found guilty by majority decision
des crimes de guerre
of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including torture, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, and outrages upon personal dignity, for the public flogging of 13 members of the population on the grounds that they had violated the rules established by Ansar Dine and AQIM, as well as for an amputation. A good number of those public punishments were videotaped or photographed, and the video footage and images were shown during the trial. Two men convicted by Ansar Dine AQIM of drinking alcohol were led on foot, handcuffed to each other to a public square by members of the Islamic police. Alongside other Ansar Dine AQIM members, Alhassan flogged the two men, who each received about 80 strokes of the cane in front of a crowd that also included children. Alhassan supervised the execution of that punishment jointly with a colleague from the Islamic police, and he provided the key to unlock the handcuffs, chaining the two men to each other so that the punishment could be inflicted. Alhassan himself inflicted at least 34 and 37 lashes, respectively, on the two victims. The suffering of these two men was visible as they endured their punishment in public. P0565 and P0557. A couple with a young baby were arrested by the Islamic police. They were detained for 2 or 3 days at the headquarters of the Islamic police in deplorable conditions. In particular, P0565, who was under the age of 15 at the time, was held in a small room with neither ventilation nor food, and she had to relieve herself on the floor. She and her companion, P0557, were convicted by the Islamic court and then taken away on the same day to receive 100 brutal strokes of the cane each on their backs, administered by different members of Ansar Dine AQIM together. P0557 was whipped with a rope that is usually used to beat animals. A witness who had been in the crowd told the court that it was unbearable to watch. The two victims suffered significant bodily injuries. After being beaten, P0557 had marks all over his shoulders, back, and thighs, and the scars are still visible to this day. P0565 suffered an inflammation and some bruising. The two victims also testified about the fear and the humiliation that they felt. After their ordeal, members of Ansar Dine and AQIM forced them to marry each other on the same day that they were brutally flogged. For a long time, the two victims suffered from social stigma following their flogging. They were also the subject of public rumors about the circumstances of their marriage after these events. The Islamic police played an important role in the enforcement of the punishment, with Alhassan aiding and abetting the process. He was present during those acts, wearing the Islamic police vest, and he helped to ensure security during the flogging and to guarantee the efficient and effective enforcement of the punishment. 6 other persons were convicted by the Islamic court for engaging in sexual relations outside of marriage and then flogged in public by members of Ansar Dine and AQIM in front of many people, including children in particular.
Les 6 victimes
The 6 victims received 100 lashes each. 2 of the victims were also detained prior to their appearance before the Islamic court. Alhassan provided help and assistance on this occasion by being present during the incident and helping to ensure security during the flogging, as well as to guarantee the efficient and effective enforcement of the punishment. The 6 victims are Kudi bint Ibrahim, Abdullah bin Makkah, bint Ibrahim, Ahmad bin Mohamed,
Hussein
Al-Hussein
Umar
bin Umar
et
and
Halima
Halima bint Mohamed.
Salaka bint Al-Qaida
Members
a
of
été
Ansar Dine
interpellée
AQIM
par des membres
was
d'Ansar
violently,
Dine
or rather violently arrested Salak bint
de son compagnon
Al-Qaida at the residence of her partner late at night
Elle a été
and
accusée
accused her
d'avoir entretenu
of having
des relations sexuelles
sex outside of marriage.
Elle a été détenue
She was
au
detained
siège de la Hesba
at the Hezbollah
pendant
headquarters for several days.
Elle a été enfermée
She was locked up
sans nourriture
without food
dans une cellule extrêmement petite
in an extremely small
de
cell
barreaux
with
qui
bars
sentait très mauvais
which had a
et dans
pungent
laquelle
smell
elle avait du mal à respirer.
and in which she had difficulty breathing.
Elle a dû faire ses besoins
She had to relieve herself
le sol.
on the floor.
Elle a ensuite été condamnée par le tribunal
She
islamique
was later convicted
et maintenue en
by
cours
the
en
Islamic
détention.
court and held in detention
Ensuite, elle a été
further.
violemment flagellée
She was then
par des membres
violently flogged by members of Ansar Dine
recevant
and
au
AQIM
moins 50 coups de
who
fouet
administered at least 50 lashes on her in front of a crowd.
Elle a crié
She screamed
et s'est effondrée
and then she collapsed to the ground
pendant la flagellation.
during the flogging,
Et sa poitrine s'est trouvée découverte
and her chest
aux yeux du public.
was uncovered to the public eye at that event.
Un témoin a déclaré à la cour que la flagellation
One witness told the
avait
court
dégoûté
that
tout le monde
the flogging was disgusting to everyone
et lui avait brisé le cœur.
and that it had broken his heart.
Salaka bint Al-Qaida
Salaka bint
souffre
Al-Qaida
encore
is still suffering
des suites de ses blessures
from the injuries
qui lui ont été infligées.
inflicted on her.
Abdoul Traoré
Madou
a été
Traoré
condamné
was
par le
also
tribunal islamique
convicted by the Islamic court
pour avoir eu de relations sexuelles
for having sexual relations outside of marriage.
flagellé en même temps que
He was flogged
Salaka bint
at the same time
Al-Qaida.
as Salaka bint Al-Qaida.
Il avait au préalable été contraint
Before the flogging,
d'enlever le pull qu'il portait
he had been forced
qui aurait atténué
to take off the pullover he was wearing, which could have cushioned the blows.
frappé au moins 39 fois.
He received at least
Il souffrait
39 lashes
sous le coup
and was visibly in pain from the whippings,
après la flagellation.
and
Il saignait.
he continued to bleed after the flogging.
Un homme âgé du nom de Foma,
An elderly man named Foma,
mince et de petite stature,
who was thin and of a short stature,
au marché,
was arrested
un membre
at the market
d'In
by a member of Ansar Dine and AQIM
au motif qu'il fumait
on the
une
grounds
cigarette.
that he was smoking a cigarette.
Le membre d'Ansar Dine, AQIM,
The Ansar Dine
tenté de l'amener de
AQIM
force.
member
Et lorsque
tried
Foma
to
a
take him
refusé,
away by force,
il lui a
but
infligé
when Foma refused,
un coup de fouet
he inflicted
devant
10
d'autres personnes.
lashes on him on the spot
Après cela,
in front of
Foma
other persons.
était en sanglots
Thereafter,
du marché
Foma was
et il se sentait
sobbing
mal
in the middle of the market
et
as he felt unwell and anxious.
enfin, Dedeu
Finally,
Maïga.
Dedeu Maiga.
Dedeu Maïga a été
Dedeu
arrêté
Maiga
par
was
Hassan
arrested by Alhassan
et d'autres agents de la
and
police
other
islamique
Islamic police
car soupçonné
officers
de vol
who suspected him of theft,
pendant plusieurs semaines.
and he was detained for several weeks.
Sa famille a tenté en vain
His family
de négocier sa libération.
tried in vain to negotiate his
Il a été
release.
condamné par le tribunal islamique, après quoi
He was convicted
membres
by the Islamic
d'Ansar Dine,
court,
AQIM,
and thereafter,
l'ont emmené
members of
sur une grande
Ansar
place,
Dine AQIM took
l'ont
him
attaché
to a major
sur une
public
chaîne
square and tied him to a chair
de foule.
in front of a large crowd.
Ils lui ont attaché les chevilles
They tied his
avec
ankles
des chaînes
with chains
et lui ont couvert la tête.
and covered his head.
Ils lui ont ensuite coupé la main droite
They then proceeded to cut off his right hand
avec une scie
with a
ou
saw
une machette.
or a machete.
En Sardine,
Ansar Dine
AQIM
AQIM
avait au préalable
had
annoncé
previously made a public announcement
le châtiment
of
et
the
avait
punishment
invité la population
and invited
à se rendre
the
sur la
population
place
to
pour y
gather
assister.
at the square to witness it.
Un témoin qui était présent dans la foule
A witness who was present in the
et qui a
crowd
assisté à l'amputation
and saw
a déclaré
the amputation said afterwards
les gens étaient partis
that
très vite.
people dispersed very quickly and that the sky
Car c'était
had darkened
un acte cruel.
because they had witnessed a cruel
Le
act.
témoin également présent dans la foule
Another witness who
après
was
l'amputation,
also present in the
je
crowd
cite,
said the following after the amputation,
était cassé.
and I quote, "The morale was
Il y avait
broken.
peu de mouvement dans la ville,
There was little movement in the city,
que c'était un silence de cimetière.
and it was like a graveyard
Que tout le
silence.
monde restait chez lui.
So everyone remained at
Fin de
home."
citation.
End of quote.
Un autre habitant a décrit l'amputation
Another resident described the amputation as, and I quote,
douce froide
a cold shower
toute la ville.
on the entire city.
Fin de citation.
End of quote.
Dedeu
Dedeu Maiga
a été ostracisé.
was ostracized after the amputation,
Et il en a souffert psychologiquement.
and has suffered psychologically from this event.
Et il est décédé quelque temps après.
He died shortly thereafter.
Pour les crimes commis à l'encontre de Dedeu Maïga,
For those crimes committed against Dedeu Maiga,
Bent Al-Qaïda,
Salaka bent al-Qair Madou Traoré,
et Foma,
and Foma,
la contribution d'Alhassan découle du rôle
Al-Hassan's contribution stems from the role he played
de haut rang
in his capacity as a high-ranking member of the Islamic police,
fait que
and from
celle-ci
the fact that
a joué un
he
rôle
also played a
essentiel
key role
dans le système
in the
qu'Ansar Dine
Ansar Dine
and
AQIM system
a construit
that
pour
was
commettre
set
ces
up
crimes.
to commit those crimes.
S'agissant de ces faits,
With regard
la
to
Chambre
those facts, the chamber found
a soit
that Al-Hassan
directement commis
either
un certain nombre de crimes de
directly committed
contre
a number of war crimes and crimes against humanity,
notamment
including
les crimes de
the crimes of torture,
d'autres actes inhumains,
other inhumane
de
acts,
traitements cruels,
cruel treatment,
d'atteinte à la dignité
outrages upon personal dignity,
de mutilation
mutilation,
et de persécution,
and persecution,
soit a apporté son aide
or that he
et son concours
aided and
à
abetted
leur commission
or contributed to the commission
contribué.
of such crimes.
La Chambre a conclu
The chamber found that
des crimes de guerre et des crimes contre l'humanité,
Ansar Dine
notamment
and
d'autres actes
AQIM
inhumains,
had committed war crimes and
de
crimes
traitements
against
cruels,
humanity, including other inhuman acts, cruel
d'atteinte à
treatment,
la dignité
rape,
de la personne
and outrages upon personal dignity
contre 4 femmes,
against 4 women living
la ville de Tombouctou,
in the city of
dans le
Timbuktu,
contexte de leur arrestation,
within the context of
détention,
their arrest
Ansar
and detention
AQIM.
by Ansar Dine and AQIM.
Abdoul a été arrêté
Azahara Abdoul
Ansar Dine
was arrested by members of
au motif
Ansar Dine
qu'elle ne
AQIM
portait pas de voile.
on the grounds that she was not wearing a veil.
2 hommes armés l'ont poursuivi,
2 armed men chased her
l'ont attrapé
all the way into her house,
et
grabbed her
lorsqu'elle résistait,
by the hand,
l'ont frappé
and while she was resisting, they beat her
de sa famille.
in front of her family members.
Des membres d'Ansar Dine AQIM
Members of Ansar Dine
au
AQIM
siège de la Hesba
then detained the victim
pendant environ
at the Hesba headquarters for about 3 days,
des membres de la Hesba
during which time
l'ont violée
members
et menacée
of the Hesba
de mort.
raped her and threatened her with death.
P0636
P0636 was arrested
par des
on the
membres
streets by members
d'Ansar
of
Dine
Ansar Dine AQIM
au motif
on the grounds that she was not wearing a veil.
elle a été détenue au siège
She was detained at the Hesba
dans le
headquarters
local où se trouvait le guichet automatique.
in the room where the ATM was
Local qui sentait
located.
l'urine et où il n'y avait pas
That room smelled of
et où il n'y avait qu'une natte au sol.
urine, and there was only a mat
Elle n'a rien reçu
on the floor.
à manger.
By the way, she did not receive
Sa
anything
détention,
to eat. On the first night of her detention, 3 armed men from the Hezbollah raped P0636 in turn and at gunpoint. Regarding P0570, the emir of the Hezbollah, Mohamed Musa, and 3 other armed members of the Hezbollah arrested the victim on the ground that she was not properly covered. They threw her into their car and drove off as members of her family chased after them. Mohamed Musa and other men drove to and detained P0570 at the Hezbollah headquarters in a dark room in which there was a mattress on the floor. Shortly thereafter, they took turns raping her. On that occasion, she was struck and threatened, and they threatened to kill her. P0570 suffered so much so that she lost consciousness. She only woke up at the hospital in Timbuktu, where she ended up spending a month and a half. Regarding Fadimata Mint Lili, members of Ansar Dine AQIM flogged her once on her back after telling her that she was not adequately covered. They then took her and detained her for a day at the Hezbollah headquarters in a small windowless room where 3 other women were held. She had nothing to eat nor to drink. The female inmates or female persons held in detention relieved themselves on a mat. During her detention, Fadimata Mint Lili was raped by a member of Hezbollah who also told her that she would be killed. For various reasons outlined in detail in the judgment, another majority of the chamber, with Judge Prost dissenting, considered that Alhassan should be found not guilty for the various crimes committed by members of the Hezbollah against these 4 women. Judge Akane was of the view that neither the required contribution of the accused to these crimes nor the psychological element concerning the rapes while in detention have been established. she is of the view, in any event, that these crimes did not form part of the common purpose. For my part, I am of the view that these acts of violence and rape are obviously serious crimes. But, as is the case with other crimes, a ground for exemption from criminal responsibility should apply. Regarding the 4 cases of forced marriages which constitute crimes against humanity or other inhumane acts, as well as underlying acts of rape and sexual slavery, which constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, the Chamber took the view that the following facts have been established. Regarding P0520, members of Ansar Dine AQIM approached his house asking to marry her, rather approached her house demanding to marry her. Despite the repeated refusals of P0520, they continued to insist, to the point where one of them pointed his gun at her, saying that she was obliged to accept. Otherwise, they would take her away forcibly. P0520 felt compelled to do what the men had demanded, fearing what might happen to her family if she refused. The group then celebrated the religious marriage in the absence of P0520 and her parents. P0520 was then taken to a house where the man she was married off to tried to get her into the room, claiming that she was his wife. She refused to enter, saying that she had been brought there by force. The man pushed her into the room and raped her. He raped her several times over a period of 24 days. P0520 was kept in 2 houses in succession, one of which had a door with bars that could not be opened. During that period, the man discovered one day that P0520 was in possession of birth control pills. He accused her of killing his children, whipped her, and then sent her to jail for one night. He then later brought her home to his house and continued to rape her. One day, P0520 managed to escape, taking advantage of the fact that a gate had been left open. She never saw the man she was married to again. P1162. P1162 was in the same prison as the same house as P0520, along with the other women who had also had, quote-unquote, husbands. She was a young girl, about 15 years old. The chamber found by majority, with Judge Akane dissenting, that P1162 was also forcibly taken into marriage by an Ansar Dine man, and that she was subjected to sexual violence at his hands. In another case of forced marriage, members of Ansar Dine AQIM went to P0610's house repeatedly, asking to marry her. At that time, P0610 was between 13 and 15 years old. So she hid at a neighbor's house while the men were at hers. Later on, her mother told her that it was not possible to refuse. Otherwise, they would be killed or harmed by the Islamists. P0610 did not want to get married, but she was afraid and believed that she had no choice because, and I quote, they were the ones who ran everything in Timbuktu. End of quote. Ansar Dine AQIM members then arranged a wedding or marriage between P0610 and one of the Ansar Dine AQIM men. A sum of money was paid, but there was no celebration or ceremony at the mosque. P0610 was taken to a house where the man she was married to eventually joined her. He tried to touch her, but she refused. And so he slapped her. Then he raped her. And then left the room and did not come back. The next day, P0610 was only able to walk,
Un ami l'a aidé à
quote
retourner
unquote,
chez sa mère.
little by little, and a friend helped her
P.
back to her mother's house.
610 n'a jamais
P0610 never saw her alleged husband ever
Les voisins et
again.
des amis ont appris ce
Neighbors
qui était arrivé.
and friends found out about what had happened to her
À chuchoter
and,
sur elle.
quote unquote, began to whisper about her.
P070 a
P0610
énormément souffert. Lui était arrivé
suffered enormously
de ce que
from
lui
what
faisait subir cet homme
had happened to her,
et elle en
from what this man had subjected her to, and still suffers from it
En ce qui concerne
to this day.
P0538,
As for P0538,
sa famille, après avoir refusé une première fois,
her family,
a fini par accepter son mariage
after refusing the first time,
après avoir été menacée
ended up
par des hommes
accepting
Dine
her marriage after receiving threats from the men of Ansar Dine AQIM.
Ces derniers ont jeté une somme d'argent au père de
Those men
P538
threw an amount of money
dont il s'agissait de
at P0538's father, claiming that it was the dowry.
a donc été marié
P0538
d'Ansar Dine
was therefore married to a member of Ansar Dine AQIM,
à ce mariage.
yet she never herself consented to the marriage.
Des membres d'Ansar Dine
Members of Ansar Dine AQIM forced her into a vehicle
l'ont conduite
and drove
à la maison de son
her
entre guillemets
to her quote-unquote husband's house
la fouettant lorsqu'elle résistait.
and flogging her whenever she resisted.
Plusieurs fois, l'époux entre guillemets de
P0538's quote-unquote husband threatened her,
et plusieurs fois
abused and raped her several times,
0538
and P0538 ran away several times as well.
suite à une plainte de son époux entre guillemets
Following a complaint by
police islamique
her quote-unquote
contre
husband
P0538,
to the Islamic police,
sa
a
famille
complaint against P0538 and her family,
interféré dans le mariage,
accusing them of interfering in their marriage.
de divorce a été
Divorce proceedings were initiated
tribunal
before the Islamic court.
le divorce a été prononcé
Divorce was finally
6 à 8 mois
granted
que
6 to 8 months
avait été jeté
after
au père
the dowry
de
was thrown
P538.
at P0538's father.
Pour différentes raisons détaillées dans le jugement,
For various reasons as detailed and outlined in the judgment,
la juge Prost
a majority of the chamber, Judge Prost dissenting, considers
Hassan
that Alhassan
doit être déclaré
should be found not guilty for the various crimes committed
dans le cadre
in the context
de mariage.
of these forced marriages.
En effet, la juge
In fact,
Akane
Judge Akane considers or is of the view that it has not been established that Alhassan made the requisite contribution to these crimes, or that the contextual elements of the crimes against humanity were satisfied. She also finds that in any event, these crimes are not part of the common purpose. For my part, I consider and am of the view that a ground for exemption from criminal liability should apply. Alhassan is also found guilty by the majority. I, dissenting, of war crimes of conviction without due process. In addition to the convictions handed down by the Islamic court against the victims already mentioned, the Chamber finds that a significant number of other persons were also convicted by the Islamic court, which was neither independent nor impartial. Furthermore, members of Ansar Dine AQIM also imposed sentences on persons who had not been previously tried by the Islamic court, including particularly with regard to crimes committed against an old man whose name was former, already mentioned above. The Chamber finds that as a result of his participation in the work of the Islamic court, in his capacity as a member of the Islamic police, particularly in relation to drafting and signing police reports, participating in the transfer of the accused persons to the courts, and involvement in the judgment and sentences handed down by the tribunal, or rather, implementing such judgments and sentences. In so doing, Alhassan made a contribution to the system established by Ansar Dine AQIM, and therefore to the commission of the crimes against the above-mentioned persons under Article 25, 3D of the Rome Statute. His behavior and active participation on the work of the police. Through this, Alhassan demonstrated that he intended to adopt the behavior and conduct that contributed to the commission of the crimes of imposing sentences without prior judgment by a court, as well as to the convictions handed down by the Islamic court without due process. Alhassan knew and also supported, he knew about and also supported the criminal activities of Ansar Dine and AQIM. Furthermore, he was aware of the importance of his work in relation to the activities of the Islamic Court, as well as the influence that senior Ansar Dine and AQIM officials had over the Islamic Court and its members. Finally, the Chamber is of the view that there is insufficient evidence to establish that Alhassan took any special or particular measures or action or played a significant role in the demolition of the mausoleums, and therefore accordingly finds him not guilty of the war crime of attacks against protected objects referred to in Article 8(2)(e)(4) of the Rome Statute. For the reasons set out in detail in the judgment, the majority finds that there is no ground for exonerating Alhassan from criminal responsibility in relation to the crimes mentioned. For my part, I append a dissenting opinion on the question of the existence of duress and an error of law on the basis of Articles 31(1)(d) and 32(2) of the statute. I shall now proceed to conclude by reading the verdict of the Chamber in this case. May I now ask Mr. Alhassan to please rise. Mr. Alhassan, please rise. Mr. Alhassan, based on the analysis of the evidence adduced and considered at trial, as set out in the judgment of the Chamber, the Chamber finds Mr. Alhassan guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes. As detailed out in the judgment of the Chamber, Mr. Alhassan is guilty as follows: on the basis of Articles 25(3)(a), (c) and 25(3)(d) of the statute, of 1. Crimes against humanity and war crimes of torture, and 2. War crimes, outrages upon personal dignity. On the basis of Article 25(3)(d) of the statute, 1. War crimes, cruel treatment. 2. Other inhumane acts against humanity. 3. War crimes consisting of pronouncement of convictions without a prior judgment or trial, handed down by a regularly constituted court, functioning with judicial guarantees that are generally recognized as indispensable. 4.
crime contre
a
l'humanité
crime against humanity of persecution
pour des motifs
on religious grounds. And 5 rather,
du crime de guerre,
the war crime
de mutilation.
of mutilation.
Alhassan est acquitté
Alhassan
s'agissant des charges
is acquitted
1.
of the following charges. 1. War crimes of attack on protected objects.
2.
2.
Le crime de guerre, le
Other
crime contre l'humanité, d'autres actes
inhuman
inhumains
acts in the form of
prenant la forme de mariage forcé.
forced marriages.
3.
And 3. Crimes against humanity and war crimes of sexual slavery. And 4. Crimes against humanity and war crimes of rape. I have now come to the end of the oral summary of the main findings of the House, of the chamber rather. Mr. Alhassan, please be seated. As I already told you, only the written decision of the chamber, based on Article 74.5 of the Rome Statute, is authoritative. It contains a full and reasoned statement of the chamber's findings, as well as the respective views of the judges, as expressed, if any. A public and confidential version of this judgment will be notified shortly. An order from this chamber setting out the timetable for the procedure of sentencing that should apply to Mr. Alhassan will be issued shortly and made public accordingly. As usual, I would like to very sincerely thank all those who have participated in today's hearing. I'm thinking about the parties and the participants. I am thinking of our brave interpreters and, of course, our security officers. Of course, I also acknowledge the presence of the public, of those present in the public gallery, as well as those listening to us online. This concludes our hearing, and the hearing is adjourned.